blindingly obvious question. It doesn't even need to be asked. Wouldn't really think of asking a doctor, like, what does it mean to be good at your job? It should seem so obvious, doesn't it? But it's kind of very knowledge rich. It's not knowledge only, it's not only knowledge or anything like that, but if this is getting rolled out properly and effectively, then it's actually possibly the most disadvantaged and the poorest in society who stand to benefit the most from this. There's so much nuance to it. So I think what you have to then do, you've got these 30 brains in front of you at any given time, and they're all processing things in their own way. And it's a messy business, Kieran, isn't it? The whole area of learning.
The expertise of someone else writing a really carefully crafted sequence of questions gives you the freedom then to support the pupils who are either struggling or the pupils who have demonstrated they're ready to go even deeper into this concept.
The depth to which you can apply that only goes as far as the base that you've built it on.
Welcome to Thinking Deeply About Primary Education, the podcast that makes time and space to think about pedagogy, teaching and learning, professional development, anything of interest to time-poor but enthusiasm-rich primary teachers. This week, I'm joined by Matthew Best for the first of 2 episodes about effective teaching and learning and what we can do to support our teachers in developing their practice. So this one's all about maths, effective PD, research engagement, all the TDAPE classics, but with a twist is that we're looking at it in the context of Northern Ireland and the Transform Ed movement that's picking up speed over there. So even if you're a long-time listener, I think there's a lot to reflect on, a lot of analogies that Matthew uses, a lot of advice Matthew has that actually would, even the most experienced teacher can learn from. But certainly if you're dipping your toe into the world of research engagement and evidence-informed practice, then this is the one for you. So without further ado, let's spend some time thinking deeply about primary education. Matthew, it's lovely to see you today. How are you?
I am good, Kieran. Thank you for having me on. It's good to make contact again after our work together.
It's an absolute pleasure. Looking forward to chatting with you for a long time, and hopefully the first of many chats. We're going to explore. I think effective teaching and learning mathematics is the ballpark, but with lots of tangents to go off in. But I thought we'd maybe start with a little bit about who you are and how you got here today.
Okay, Kieran, super. So my name is Matthew. I'm a P7 teacher here in Northern Ireland. I'm in charge of maths in my school. I'm a member of the senior team, and I have responsibility for a lot of assessment in the assessment team as well. So I get a good look at data and target setting and benchmarking and all that kind of stuff as well. So when I found out that there was going to be a completely reworking of the curriculum, I was keen to get involved in that. So I reached out in terms of the application process, and I was brought onto the drafting team, subject working contributor, and that's how I got to know you and your role in that as well. So it's been a really great journey this year. I've developed myself a lot. I've got lots of interesting insights, and even just my own presuppositions and things that I was maybe possibly holding quite closely. It's challenged a lot of things there. So I think it's been really good for everyone all around.
Yeah, no, it was a fantastic experience. I'm really excited to see what happens, and I think it'll drive a lot of the conversations, because I think a lot of teachers, like you say, I think the direction of travel is exciting, but I think it can also be, it's almost like the Giro d'Italia's just finished one of those big 5,000 meter days on the bike before we'll see the fruits of our labor, I think.
The Queen stage.
If we get right into it, what does effective maths teaching look like to you?
It's such an interesting question, because it sounds, if you're speaking to someone who isn't in education, they'd be thinking of almost a blindingly obvious question. It doesn't even need to be asked. You wouldn't really think of asking a doctor, like, what does it mean to be good at your job? It should seem so obvious, doesn't it? But I think that's the biggest problem in education, that question does have to be asked. It is pertinent. When you dig into it a bit and just kind of peel back the layers a little bit, you realize your own biases are coming out a wee bit. We all have bits of baggage and our own values that we kind of hold on to. If you were to ask maybe 10 different teachers what it means to be effective in their domain, you're going to get 10 very different answers on that. So much signal noise about it. It gets quite political at times, and it's just a complete hot potato over here at times as well. But I would try to define it as best as I can as effective teaching is you are directly bringing about the maximum amount of learning for the most number of pupils possible in your class. I guess that then begs the question of what we think learning is. And as we've encountered a lot in our work in the curriculum review, it's not as simple as it looks like. I would say basically to be an effective maths teacher, and in the primary sector where we're both from, every teacher is a maths teacher. So we're trying to drive long-term memory change in the pupils. So we're trying to make sure, because of their time with us as the teacher, there are things that at the end of their journey with you, they now know or can do that I guess they weren't able to do or didn't know before that. And I think that's probably the closest I would hold that.
Dan, I think Dan Winning was over in Northern Ireland recently, wasn't he? I mean, do you think that's going to be like, are many people on board with that definition? Because it definitely got a lot of pushback in like the maybe early 2010s in England, where it was like, there was definitely once, like you say, it can get political. It was a reasonably pointed conversation about whether or not that was the definition. I mean, what do you think the reception has been like for that?
I think there's a couple of things. There's a lot of moving parts in this. I think most people in my experience would agree with that. I think it's just that there's a certain amount of space in the whole orbit, in the whole kind of discussion around this, and it feels possibly some of the pushback that we get on that is maybe that I see what's happening here. This is like a trad model. This is about this is I know this is traditional teaching, and this means then that you're pushing for a view of education that doesn't allow for possibly strong pastoral care, that doesn't possibly take issues of safeguarding as important as you should do, and all these kind of things. And they sort of tried, I think people mistakenly box that in and think, oh, I know what that was. I went to school back in 19 blah blah blah, and this sounds just like a very old and outdated or antiquated type of teaching. Or the big one is that people mistake that for like almost like a kind of right wing agenda, or that it's something that like benefits a certain type of person or people from a certain type of background. It was really interesting. Lucy Crane, who I know you've had her on your show as well, like she ended up on the news talking about that, because she was defending against the allegation that it was something of a right-wing model, and she made the really good point, which is that if this is getting ruled out properly, this kind of very knowledge rich, it's not knowledge only, it's not only knowledge or anything like that, but if this is getting ruled out properly and effectively, then it's actually possibly the most disadvantaged and the poorest in society who stand to benefit the most from this. In a school like my own, where we don't have just as much of the free school meal ratio, technically we're already performing pretty highly. Like, we're not going to see a massive increase in terms of what we're going to expect from our pupils. We're kind of doing, I feel, what works pretty well and what's keeping in tandem and in step with a lot of the discussion and discourse around transform ed. But I think it's actually a lot of the schools that maybe have the greatest amount of need stand to benefit the most from this. And it's a really difficult conversation to have. As you mentioned, things can be loaded, and they can it's one of those things you want to try and avoid, and just try and keep this as much as possible about cognition and about pedagogy and about curriculum, and just keep this completely clean, because I don't have any time for any of that. That is not at all why I'm involved in this. And it is quite demoralizing when you do start to hear that type of criticism, or those kind of sort of cynical takes on things. Like, we're all learning, aren't we? Like, so we should constantly be on that journey and open to it. I mean, I trained here in Northern Ireland under the revised curriculum, and that was brought in around 2007, 2008. So we were the guinea pigs. Our initial teacher training was very much being trained under that model, and it was completely the opposite. And we you develop these instincts, and I wouldn't claim to be an expert in anything pedagogical. I haven't written any books or anything like that, but I've got really good instincts, I think. And I think that comes down to experience. And I think whenever you're with a class of 30 children year on year, you start to figure out stuff that works. You start to realize things that work, that look like learning. You start to get certain signals back, and you start to hone that year on year. And also you start to realize certain things don't work, and you start to figure out that a lot of this wasn't. The more you dig into this, I assumed early on, naively as a 22-year-old, that these were all correct answers, and there was a lot of science behind that stuff that was proven. And you start to realize a lot of these things are just a bit of noise, and it was maybe started off very well intentioned, and one thing starts off in a planner or becomes a policy and in another school, and eventually it becomes this sort of system-wide thing. And we have all these initiatives. Kieran, I could probably do a whole series of podcasts with you about primary school being a particularly vulnerable area for bad ideas. I think what grounds a lot of the post-primary teachers, my wife's in the post-primary sector, they have exams, they have GCSEs, they have A levels, they have university places. So in some way that holds them accountable to an extent. So they can't veer too far away from that, really. There is still a lot of that stuff going around. But in primary schools particularly, so much of teacher time is completely taken up, and teachers are being swamped and swarmed with initiatives. And none of those things, I can mention lots of names of things: forest schools, eco schools, wellbeing ambassadors, school counselors, all, and that goes on and on and on. That list could just go on definitely. None of those things in and of themselves are bad, or we've got some of those initiatives in our school and the kids like it, and it's fine. I have no problem with that. But the teaching and learning has definitely lost out in some of these models because of that, because we're learning a lot about opportunity cost. And John Thompson spoke to our staff a number of years ago about that, and he really got me thinking about that. But he said, as a senior leader, he obsessed over that idea that anything you spend time doing is that you're sacrificing something else for. And it's all well and good just thinking we can just keep adding on more and more things. And it is actually the work in the class that suffers there. The more and more you push into that, and it becomes a bit of an arms race. So you find out a local school, because there's a lot of competition in areas. So I am on a tangent here now, Kieran, but people launch these kind of initiatives, and parents are looking around with their little children at nursery school thinking what school to go to. And it's all very warm, isn't it? Warm and friendly and nurturing. And that then becomes something that other schools want to take on, and they get their watermarks for their website and for their letterheads and all of that. And none of those things are bad in and of themselves. But one thing I really admire about all the work that we've done in this curriculum review, and the whole point of Transform Ed is putting teaching and learning back in the middle of this again. And I think that's really exciting. I want to take for granted that children come to school happy, and that we can be a safe space for kids, and that children know who to speak to if they're unsure about things. And we need to absolutely get that message out. But the balance is off. The balance is really off on that. And yes, there's been a lot of flack that gets taken by people who try to do that, and it is unfortunate. But I think people need to try to be a bit more positive and optimistic about this, because the curriculum that we've put together here, it's good, and it's going to give teachers hopefully a lot of assurances and things. So a lot can get in the way, but I am feeling good about it.
The thing I always think about is every child in Northern Ireland having access to the same high quality education. That is something, if we can manage that, that would be amazing. And there are two things that really stand out to me in what you said there, right? The two big logical fallacies that maths education struggles with are the straw man, where it's easy to build up this imaginary position because the straw man's easy to attack, and the false dichotomy. And if you think about every single layer of math teaching, there's is it procedural? Is it conceptual? Is it this methods, or is it, whatever, there are lots of ways where things are set up against each other, and really it's the nuance. But what you said about real teachers in classrooms work out what works. So if we give them access, or if they're given, I say we as if I have any control of this, but if teachers are given access to that really powerful knowledge about the most effective way to transfer knowledge, like you say, from the novice from the expert to the novice, then they'll realize, well, actually, not only am I more effective, but I'm also saving a whole lot of time, because like you say, every minute spent on X initiative is a minute not thinking about which questions am I going to ask my class tomorrow. So my faith is in teachers to drive that, because obviously I don't want to be the teacher, because when a teacher comes from another school and they say, in my school but because like in 2012, whenever they released the consultation, it was very much the same shift that the teachers in England and in primary and secondary were expected to go through. And so having seen that firsthand, I've seen the power of the classroom and the power of things like research ed, which I hope come to Belfast and different parts of the north more frequently, because I think that's where it's in teachers and teachers driving things forward. That's what gives me the greatest amount of hope that actually every child will, because with this highly specific outline of what every child is entitled to learn, well, then we can then turn our attention to, well, actually, what's the best way for them to learn this? Because then they become members of society that contribute in the most powerful way. And having worked in disadvantaged areas my whole career, what you say about it, I've seen that bear out. Those kids benefit the most from high quality teaching like this. So fingers crossed, I suppose, is what I'm trying to say.
There was, just on to pick you up on that point. I remember it was quite controversial at the time, but he was quoted on this. But John Thompson was quoted as saying that the best type of pastoral care you can give to children from the most disadvantaged areas is a really high quality set of exam results. And a lot of people push back against that, and that was seen as very almost uncaring or something like that. But he was onto something, and that's a really important point because we want to take it as given that teachers are warm and they're supportive to the children under their care. I mean, absolutely. It's a straw man argument, as you said, because people will come back, but what do he's right, equality of opportunity and giving people the chance to perform to the absolute best of their potential, that's really important. And I think he hit on a real nerve there.
What would the key features of a typical Matthew Best maths lesson or learning sequence look like, and what would you not see?
Thankfully, I work in a school where everybody is getting it. We're following the evidence, we're looking at what works, what doesn't work, and so on. But yeah, one of the things I would say is I like a really calm and predictable classroom. That's the first thing. Everything is just basically designed for the kids to be able to participate fully, being able to see me and listen to me. And that sounds like so obvious. It sounds like something I shouldn't have to tell you, but there are so many classrooms up and down the country where the kids at a certain age, they're not even able to see the teacher properly because they're facing each other and so on. They can't even maybe having to crane their necks to see the board. So we have all that pretty well dialed in. I tend as much as possible to stick to a simple recipe. Learning is so complex. There's so much nuance to it. So I think what you have to then do, you've got these 30 brains in front of you at any given time, and they're all processing things in their own way. And it's a messy business, Kieran, isn't it? It's a messy business, the whole area of learning. So I think the best way to go about that is to try and keep a really sequential and clear and predictable type of environment for the children every day. And even that just goes even in the morning. I make sure my maths lesson is first thing. Maths is hard, it's abstract, it's complex. They're having to think very deeply about it all. And I like to get them on that early in the morning when they're fresh. It's just the way I like to do things. I try not to deviate too much from the kind of I do, we do, you do type of formula. It's not always completely locked in and as precise as that, but it's the sort of thing that I think works really, really well with the boys and girls. You're sort of explaining a concept. You could be going through some process, like find the area of a triangle. I like to have the stuff under a visualizer. I think the visualizer is fantastic. And again, it's another type of thing where teachers have told me they feel in primary almost embarrassed about senior leader coming into their classroom and seeing them sitting with a visualizer at their desk, kids all facing the front with their hands up. They feel that that's somehow old-fashioned or archaic, and it's not. Maybe it's just not the most contemporary way of doing things. But I think it's fantastic because they see what you're all looking at the same thing. I have a workbook just like them, so I'll go through something, and obviously you need to make sure you're activating that prior knowledge at all times. You know more than anyone how sequential and cumulative maths is, and you just one thing unlocks the door to the next thing. So you've got to be very, very careful with your questioning when you're introducing a concept. A lot of direct instruction here. You've got to have full attention at all times, explain a concept. And that's my chance to really go over the instructions. And you have to kind of harness this. You don't want to over explain something because there's a lack of clarity. But if you undercook it, there are going to be big gaps and so on. So you're trying to harness that. And my chance to do that is when I'm introducing it, going through at the start, showing them worked example and so on. And again, all eyes are on me. I'll be stopping, doing a lot of questioning, a lot of cold calling, trying to gauge the temperature along the way. At certain points, I have sort of 5 or 6 children in my class who I know when I'm questioning them and they're on it and they're with me. I can kind of they're kind of almost like my pacing group a little bit. There's a colleague in my school who picks pacers in his lessons, and it's a fantastic way of being able to just kind of gauge the temperature and get little snapshots, because we're constantly doing that, aren't we, in our job, or at least we should be, just constantly making these snapshot assessments and so on. So yeah, a lot of that type of stuff, getting them going. Think pair share, 30 minutes, off you go on this, and keep that all brisk at the start. Then we'll move into just some worked examples, and then that's kind of where our experience and intuition kicks in. If you sort of figure out after 1 or 2 of those, there's a pretty quick click at the class, I can do another 1 or 2 of those and sort of progressively add in some more complexity. I can change some of the dimensions, the decimals and so on, but just being very careful. You're kind of doing this in little small steps. You know, too big a step and you've kind of overwhelmed them or you've lost them. So those worked examples are really, really useful. If I'm getting a sense then at that point that the vast majority, I'm thinking like 80% plus the class are really getting this very, very well, then we can start to release the control a little bit and we'll start to move towards some independent work. Now, it's not always as neat and tidy as that. Sometimes I've done that and I've just felt, you know what, they're not quite there yet. We're going to go back and do this again, or, you know, go back a few steps. And even at that, once they get onto that independent working point, then that's where I can start getting around the room and start to see that. Or I might just say, guys, do two of these and then stop. After we've just done two, stop, hold it up, get the whiteboard, show your partner, and I can get again an immediate kind of gauge. If I've gone a little bit too quick in that, you just pull it back. You're just very, very gradually kind of surfing that wave where you can. And again, that's just the intuition, and that really goes completely against everything I was trained to do as a teacher, which is so strange. That is just from myself and some colleagues in my school. Our school are really, really digging into this at the minute, and it's really just looking and being self-critical, and looking at what works and what doesn't work. And we find this type of direct instruction, especially at the age that I'm teaching at, these 10, 11-year-olds, people really underestimate children. Kieran, I don't know if that's your experience too, but they really underestimate how their children can't actually focus for longer than, I don't know, what you hear sometimes 30 seconds or something, or 2 minutes. And you have to, you constantly need to have all these props and resources. And a lot of that comes back to the teacher training too, where you were sort of, there was definitely a bias for teachers who would, sit up to 2 o'clock in the morning building the rocket, or, everything was measured in how long it took you to do it, rather than this being outcome based. And I really think the profession of teaching is crying out for a more outcome based model where we think, what is it that deems this all success? And hopefully with this curriculum we've been working on, especially the statements and things that we've been going from towards what we now, I hopefully think we have in good shape. What can we measure this against? And instead of just how long did it take you to make this, or there was a good wee while here where everything went very anti-textbook, because that was seen as lazy, because you actually hadn't physically written the questions. I know this sounds almost like too insane to even have to explain, but there is definitely a bias towards teachers who sat up making the worksheet themselves. And whoever thought that was whoever thought that a student teacher would be able to sit at night and create something better than what these teachers have been seconded off their jobs to go and make resources for. And I mean, it's the height of it's arrogant, and it's also just stupid, and it's a waste of teachers' time. So the best resource in that classroom by the biggest margin is you. You are the professional, you are the expert, and even in terms of just simple value for the taxpayer, like, we're the most expensive asset in that room. And for a long time, that was something to be embarrassed about. The teacher had to very much get offside. And there were people I've spoke to, and school leaders I've spoken to a lot, and said that they like to see brisk lessons. They like to see, teacher at the front, just do your thing 2 minutes, and then let them go off and do what they need to do and talk to each other. And almost no one was saying it, but it was just teach each other, like just get them just teaching each other. And you can kind of just be there as some sort of motivator or something, that if anyone needs you, you can kind of point them towards something, like a signpost teacher or something. Which you just wonder how, and that stuff didn't happen overnight. It just, well-intentioned sort of initiatives and ideas came in and pervaded, and then that became that. And then you start hearing all these horror stories of schools where we've got rid of the desks. Teachers don't need a desk. Teachers kind of just float around the room the whole time. And I just think as a profession we got a bit lost. And what I'm describing now, it sounds like the most obvious thing. If I was speaking to any of my friends who work in other industries, that's exactly what they would think of when they think of good teaching. They I mean, it just all sounds so silly that I have to explain to you things like, sitting, showing things, demonstrating it on a board, and worked examples, and a lot of questioning. And I mean, that is our bread and butter. And children respond remarkably well to that stable consistency, and just the high expectation as well. Kieran, in my lessons, just really expecting a lot of the kids and pushing them, and giving them appropriate praise and so on, but not just constantly telling them that everything is wonderful. I mean, if we go back, I slightly digressed again, but if the curriculum as it currently stands, when we started looking at those statements, and some of us haven't looked at that stuff in years, but you look at that curriculum that was built, and you get to something like place value, and some of the statements were things like understand the concept of place value. And that might have been the long and short of it. And there's a million ways you can interpret that, and everything can kind of become the right answer, can't it, to an extent there. Or another one was explore everyday fractions, and which ones at what age, and so back to the curriculum again. I think everything will start with curriculum, and I think this sort of classroom practice we're talking about, comes from that. But we just have to make sure that the knowledge and the skills go with the knowledge. We've got to make sure that we're absolutely clear before we start a lesson or a series of lessons. We've got to be absolutely clear what, by the end of this, do most, if not all, of the children in this class need to either know or be able to do by the end of this week, by the end of this day. If they don't know it, why not? Okay, what do you need to do again? And it just making it as meticulous as that. And that is slow and steady. Possibly some people might say that's a bit dull or a bit boring, but what you can achieve in a year of that, in 7 years of that, through a whole primary education, that change in long-term memory, those guys, hopefully, I feel it as a P7 teacher, particularly because I know that my guys every year progress their next school. So you feel that burden. You really want to make sure they're starting year 8 with the best possible foot forward, and you can accumulate a vast amount of knowledge and apply a whole lot of skills if this is right and built right. But unfortunately, I just think that there's the potential for so much wasted time in the classroom where there's so many fads. There's so many things that teachers are expected to do, to put on so many different hats in a day, and you just can lose so much time, so much time to bad ideas, So yeah, that's kind of the best of what I would say an effective lesson is. It doesn't always stick to that, Kieran. There are times where it won't always just be as precise and put in the box like that. But generally, I try to stick with that. I do, we do, you do, and it tends, I think, to deliver the best results.
There are two things that really stand out to me there. I think the first one is, like our compatriot Pat McRae would talk about attention being the currency of the classroom. It's very clear that pupils are going to remember what they pay attention to, given the sort of systems you put in place or the processes you put in place. And the idea of being like hyper responsive or like forensically responsive, whereas like our less experienced colleagues might see the plan, have written the plan, and then think, right, I'm going to stick to the plan. Whereas actually what you're describing, there's a very fluid situation. I love the wave analogy where you say you're sort of just surfing that wave for a little bit and maybe coming back, going forwards. That makes so much sense to me. Because I think what you're doing is you're taking what we know about how we learn, and then you're almost like making the most effective version of that in your classroom. That's what stands out to me, because I think you're putting, like, the word boring is thrown around a lot, and like textbooks, dirty word, I think most countries, but like I'm sure you've heard me bang on before about Tim Oates in 2014. He had his Why Textbooks Count paper, and when I saw the table about textbook usage, it was Finland, Singapore, and England. And basically, both Finland and Singapore had very high usage of textbooks. And so the numbers they were getting in 2000, in the PISA results, were a result of the Soviet regime from the previous 15 years, because obviously those kids have been taught for 15 years since 1985 or whatever. And so that was my watershed moment. And it sounds like, that because, like you say, the expertise of someone else writing a really carefully crafted sequence of questions gives you the freedom then to support the pupils who are either struggling or the pupils who have demonstrated they're ready to go even deeper into this concept.
I think as well, back just to pick you up on that issue of something possibly seen as boring. One of my colleagues, the other P7 teacher in my school, was observed last year, and what was really interesting there was that he delivered a lesson that was quite complex in the end. So he had the class, and I had done the same with my class, but his was the one that was being observed at the time, and we plan and collaborate together. He had done a lesson where the children were working out the payslip of a certain person in a profession. So they were given their gross salary. They had to go off and figure out the pension deductions from that. They had to do they're in the marginal tax rates as well, which it was brilliant. The way it all came together, it was a really, really good lesson that he delivered. And his feedback on that was just that, like, this is great. Your kids are working at such a high level, and it was great getting to see them apply that knowledge and all of that kind of stuff, because I know that this kind of real life maths is something that there's been such a push on. But actually, what's so interesting when you think about that, that the depth to which you can apply that only goes as far as the base that you've built it on. So, that would not have come together had it not been for the hours and hours of what we're talking about as boring, work examples, independent work, working at, finding 20% of this amount of money, finding 40%, how do you do that? And fractions and all that kind of stuff. And that enabled him in the end to be able to deliver a series of lessons that really was very amazing for 10, 11-year-olds, that they could apply all of that. And that's a real, talking about this kind of skill-based curriculum. Ironically, that was a real high-level skill in action, but we would not class this as a skill-based curriculum necessarily that we're delivering. We very much knowledge first, and then you apply it. And I speak to post-primary maths teachers all the time about this, and I'm in a little group of maths coordinators in my area as well, and we talk a lot about this as teachers, and the most capable problem solvers are nearly every single time, I would say without fail, know the most things. They have the best times tables. They, their knowledge of maths is exceptional because they've built up so much of that automaticity. They've learned things, and it's we talk a lot about working memory now. That was so unknown in Northern Ireland until very recently, but they have got this all in their heads, and then it's so easy for them to apply that. I mean, a good example, I was doing a little bit of work with my daughter this week, and she was doing some problem solving, and she's a P6 pupil in our school, and there was a question where you were told there were 480 cakes in a sale, and it said a sixth of them had almonds or something in them. The question was how many didn't, and on the face of it, that looks like quite complex. Thinking these kids are 9, 10 years old, and just as she was reading it, she was, and she's by no means is she top of her class or anything. She's doing grand, but this is not about boasting about how clever my daughter is. This is a point about being able to learn things. She said, oh well, 6 fits into 48. She knew that 6 was a factor of 48, so she straight away knew what a sixth of 480 was. And she just said, okay, so you just take 80 off 480. And she had that solved basically by the time she read the question. And like, again, that was just another kind of light bulb moment for me in that as well, because that, this notion, and a lot of the guys that have been involved in the pedagogy and transform ed, I've heard Carla Hendrick and those guys talk a lot about this, that you cannot teach skills in isolation, and there we go. What enabled her to solve that problem was just having learned her times tables, and that was what led her to be able to get that, instead of this kind of, that the revised curriculum was very, very much about skill-based application, real life maths, context. I talk about this a lot with people, anyone who'll listen, it's this idea that we have to continually make it relevant to real life and put it into some kind of, like a contextualize everything. And, even just the fact that we're now talking about it as mathematics again, it is showing just the kind of development there. But that was a real standout thing for me as well. And I think the application of that is so important, but the knowledge must come first. So I do agree with you.
Yeah, it's the misinterpretation of Bloom's work on almost like the different, because obviously he didn't make the pyramid, but it became a really important part of how things were described to teachers, didn't it? I mean, yeah, I'm not sure I finished my point on it. Just went from boring lessons to textbooks, but like often it's more exhilarating than learning something you didn't think you could learn, or like when pieces click together, there is no bigger rush, I don't think. And so like helping kids piece those things together. Like I was talking to a group of teachers today, and we're talking about worked examples, talking about, okay, if we look at this as part A, B, and part on A, B, and C, and I just asked this child, like say struggling, just focus on B, and that's if he can do B today but couldn't do B yesterday, that's improvement on where you were. That's that 1% better than you were yesterday, rather than comparing yourself to the rest of your peers and stuff like that. And like for me, seeing kids make those tiny little leaps is massive, and I think they feel it too. Just like we as adults, when we learn stuff that we didn't think was possible, say we're learning a language or whatever, and you get a real sense of achievement. I think children would much rather know stuff and be able to contribute to both their class and then ultimately society than, I don't know, like you say, do tasks that are on the surface engaging, but actually they're sucking the attention away from what's really important for the for the class. That I think of the teeth made of lumps or whatever. What he learned about dentistry in that kind of situation.
You're so right. And again, I've just got in mind here this. And I think we possibly discussed this in one of our calls too this year. But it was very much sold to us as, if you make this fun and interesting and engaging and hook them in, then the children have an increased chance to experience success in that domain. And I just say it's completely inverted. I think my years of experience, and again, I am absolutely no expert on pedagogy, and I would never claim to be. But again, I do feel like I've got good instincts that experience has taught me, and it is the back is complete opposite of that. Get the kids really good at something. Get them to experience success, even as you're talking about little small steps. That little 1%, that little part B, that those couple of questions that were just outside of their reach. Get them experiencing some level of success, and then the enjoyment will follow. You ask any child, you ask any teenager what their favorite subject is, they're going to tell you the subjects that they're best at. It's just how it works. But it was completely inverted. We were trained, everything had to be, it was all engagement farming, wasn't it? It was everything had to be novel, and that, and the other thing, and I am on another tangent here, Kieran, but the sort of differentiation, there's a lot to answer for there too, because that, I know that changes came in England before they came here. So under our current setup, people are encouraged this constant push to meet children where they are. That was the whole thing, so you have, and that becomes, there's an added layer of complexity with the rise in SEN and so on. But it just became that teachers were being asked to do this completely impossible task. And it's a case of the emperor's not wearing any clothes, because everybody knows that teachers cannot be all things to all people. The classroom, there's one of you and there's 30 children, that by the very definition of the whole thing, there's absolutely no way anybody can splice themselves into all these different groups, and it all became very arbitrary. Over here, it would be very, very common to hear people talking about planning maths lessons or any type of lessons, but in maths it would be, okay, right, this is your less able group, this is your sort of medium. It's like, how well do you want your steak done? It was like, you're rare, you're medium, and yet it was this sort of arbitrary 3 different distinct groups, and it's sort of that wasn't an overnight thing, but it just all morphed into this. And then the expectations just drop like a rock, don't they? Because you've got this wee group here who need a little bit more support, and they're not, so they can do these questions, and they're going to be a little bit different, and they're not going to get that, and everything just became teachers running around constantly, these different photocopied pages and these different activities. Or you would sometimes get these sort of like task board activities with maths too, where the children would move around like some sort of game of musical chairs, where they'd be just, and that is not, I mean, you'll get a significant number of children who you can get away with that for a certain number of kids. That'll work okay for some kids, because maybe they're getting great direct instruction at home. Maybe they've got, that is not a recipe for success, having all that. And this kind of, this differentiation became it almost became a kind of a religion. It was this thing you had to completely buy into, and inspectors were looking for it, and you're getting marked down if you weren't planning for it, like actively planning for 3 different groups, and how you were constantly differentiating these activities. And again, just a big push was on the activity itself, rather than what we fought for in the curriculum redesign, which is what is the actual learning, what do they need to know or be able to do. Instead, teachers are almost feeling burned out, and they're constantly thinking of what the activity is, what are the kids going to be doing, and that's the wrong question in my mind. It's completely wrong, it's completely backwards. But again, that whole emphasis and differentiation created that, I felt, where there really was a big push on 3 distinct and demarcated activities, and then it kind of fed this cycle, and the whole thing sort of got out of control, I think, Kieran. And I think that's partly why we are now in the place that we're in, but I think that's massive. You picked up on a really important point.
Out of hand is what I was about to describe the end of the last curriculum here in England, because at some points it was like 6 different lessons or 6 different activities within a lesson, and like my day would start at 7 a.m. at the latest and finish at 6 in the evening at the earliest. And maybe there's a night the school was open late and you're there at 8 o'clock, and you were just making stuff, like you said. And then the as soon as I was allowed, like, because like I say, you had to do the dance for the inspector too back then as well. So like as soon as I was given permission to teach the way I thought was most effective, and the way I was learning from people like David Ida and stuff like that, and Craig Barton and stuff, whenever I was allowed to put those things in practice, it's like, yes, this my working day could very easily be half as long, or certainly cut 4 hours off of it. And I think what to go almost full circle, like when you talk about the relationship between success and motivation, the great thing is it's also true for teachers, because if we give them success as teachers of mathematics, then they'll want more success, and then they'll become really, really effective versions. Because I work with so many teachers who really have either had really bad experiences themselves when they've grown up, or have only have had bad experiences in schools where they've been expected to do things that perhaps are less effective, or have lost them their work-life balance. And so giving them small success with things like worked examples, and where we've got like pretty clear routines established on their use, maybe even not just in mathematics but across the board, then that's when teachers they think, yes, I want more of this, and then that's when they become the leaders of their own professional development. That's when the movement, like you say, propels itself. But maybe I'm getting ahead of myself. But whenever you mentioned that relationship, I thought, yes, it is exactly the same for adults, and that could be one of the things to really push and really focus on, is how can we give teachers early success with these ideas and with the new curriculum, so that it begins to propel itself. But maybe that's a question for another day.
No, but it is so fascinating that it's a job, a profession like ours. It's remarkable because there are so many great things being done up and down the country, and then there are also people who are just so shackled to the culture that they're in, and it's not. It's an easy thing just to blame the school leaders in this, and say, well, the principal's asking for it, and that's there, but it's a system-wide thing where they're accountable to someone higher up, and it becomes, I think we've talked a lot about this, these kind of poor proxies for learning, because learning, as we've talked about, it's difficult. It's conceptually, learning is not simple, and being able to go into a classroom and measure and assess where the learning's taking place isn't easy, and that requires a lot of deep thought and multi-year process where you've no neat boxes to put that into. So what people tend to do, they tend to sort of distill that down to a type of checklist that's like a lowest common denominator, where we have all these systems in place that kind of point towards learning in a sort of vague way. And none of these things in and of themselves, Kieran, I'm saying that, some of the stuff is good. I'm not saying there shouldn't be any observations here. Don't take it like that. But there's a checklist of things now that up and down the schools in the country, there's comes the PRSD time, so people are being observed, or it's time to review the targets you've maybe set for maths for a particular class, and there's just these checklists come out, and okay, so you'll do your book scoop, you'll collect the books in, and I've been part of that as well as maths coordinator, and you're looking through the books and you're checking, right, is there enough of the different strands? So we've got a bit of a mix, number, shape, space, data, tick that off. Have the children written the learning intention down on the page? Tick, yes, well done, they've written that down. That doesn't tell us anything about what they've learned, or what is in their long-term memory, or what is not. But they've written that down. Another one is coloring traffic lights. I don't know if you know that one. So the children will color green if the lesson went well, or if they feel like they've learned that well. Amber, they got there, but they're not totally convinced on it. And red, they had no idea. They were completely stuck in that. So again, you pull the books in, and okay, that teacher has made sure they're on top of that. And then are targets displayed in the classroom? Yes. Okay, great. Do the children know what the targets are? And on it goes, Kieran, and this goes on and on. And it's very easy to get sucked up in that, and that becomes the thing. Instead of these being things that are supposed to point towards learning taking place in your building, those then become the thing, and that will possibly reward a certain type of teacher. You could be highly organized in lots of ways, and you could be all over that stuff, but maybe you're not changing the long-term memory of a concept in a group of children particularly well. You could be all over that stuff, and marking's a big one too. Like there's an absolute, we talk, what we want to be doing as much as possible is being really high impact. You're talking about work-life balance. You want teachers to be empowered to go into their day and make the greatest amount of impact during those teaching. The hours of 9 to 3, that is a magic time in your job. That is when you've got those kids in front of you, and you want to be absolutely leveraging that as much as you can, having a really big impact, being there for them every day and experiencing success. You mentioned that, having the teacher experience that same success. And wow, what a thing is that? And that's something to get excited about. But instead, as you've alluded to there, I know it was particularly bad for this. The school day was starting when the children went home. And instead of you then, sitting down with a colleague and planning out, what are we going to ask them tomorrow? Whenever we're looking at simplifying these fractions, what questions are we going to ask? What is our measure of success in this? It's running around typing things on paper, um, printing off these planners, three different ability levels. You've got SEN in there. Have you got your classroom assistant to sign it? We've got all these different strategies, and they just jumbled so many things into the bureaucratic blob of it all, that there's burnout there, and then you're expecting enthusiasm the next day, and instead, what they should really be looking at here is a way of absolutely maximizing the impact in the classroom and freeing teachers up, empowering teachers to collaborate, to start thinking about their own CPD, professional development, to get into things like research ed, like you're talking about. But instead, if I was a school leader and I was able to find an hour for one of my staff members, to write, you've an hour here, I'm going to take your class, or the class are going somewhere, you've an hour. Instead, they're going to go and they're going to grab a pile of books, and they're going to sort of slavishly just start going through a set of books to literally tick a box. And it's just, I feel like we're in that sort of 80-20 rule. I think that we are spending the vast majority of our resources on all the wrong stuff. And that you could create a 60-hour week, 70-hour week on things that have no measurable benefit to changes in the long-term memory of the pupils in your class. And yet you could be incredibly high impact by thinking more deeply about learning, by bettering yourself, by exposing yourself to the most recent research and really high value stuff out there. And there is loads of high value stuff out there that I didn't feel was open to me or accessible to me when I started teaching. But instead, it's just this almost like, and we're so institutionalized, like teachers they're not even really questioning it anymore, because it's just part of the job. It's just this sort of type up, and primary, secondary school teachers do not have the same level of bureaucracy. They've got lots of other challenges here, but I know of teachers who are submitting weekly notes to their principal. You probably did this yourself when you were in it. So a breakdown of what they're teaching every week, with learning attention, success criteria, possibly what the activity is, how you're meeting the low ability, but all that kind of stuff. Then the medium term planners every 6 weeks. I had a colleague in another school show me his 6-weekly planner, and it was 9 or 10 pages long, full of just full of everything you could possibly imagine. You couldn't even read. It was unreadable, Kieran. It was unreadable because there was just so much in it. And then there's the long-term planning, and there's just those all have to get sent to coordinators for coordinators to review. And it's just become this big blob, and no one's accountable anymore. So it's just this, and this is why I am so optimistic about Transform Ed. It feels like it's really creating an opportunity for disrupting that. And hopefully, I really am hopeful here that this will free teachers up, if they can lift off a lot of this nonsense and free them up, and getting them really inspired to be thinking more about their own practice and about how they're actually addressing the questions they're going to ask the children, and the sequencing of a series of lessons, and how they're going to collaborate with their year group colleague or their key stage, and all of that kind of stuff. That's the stuff that should excite us all. But instead, it's just honestly, they're getting bogged down in just endless paperwork, and it is such a shame, because it's among the lowest impact things you could do. It's you've probably a better chance of opening a window in a classroom and letting fresh air come in, and that would probably increase the outcomes more by tenfold than producing this paper for whoever.
Are head teachers or like senior leaders, are they the people who need to hear this message? Are they the ones who are going to free up teachers, or can teachers free themselves up within the system? What's the hierarchy like, and to what extent do head teachers, like, obviously having things like, I want to see all your planning, puts massive restrictions on a teacher, but do they have freedom to actually just go, right, put that to the side, I'm going to focus on my classroom? What's the balance like?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and I think the answer to that is it depends. I think head teachers, I mean, I can only speak for the schools that I've worked in, but I do chat a lot to lots of colleagues in different schools. And um, I think there's lots of things. I think two or three things can be true at once here. I feel that most senior leaders and head teachers probably realize that a lot of the stuff around the admin and the bureaucracy, I think, uh, I'm trying to be as fair as I can. I think most of them realize that it's excessive. Um, and I think they would probably put their hands up to say they know it's not particularly high impact. Um, but they're also in a bit of a bind as well because they are also accountable to bodies like ETI and all of that kind of stuff. So they're not going to be wanting to put their necks out and say, okay, here's what we're going to try. I think was it Adam Boxer possibly tweeted about this a couple of years ago where his department agreed that we were not going to do marking for a year or something like this. And they said, right, we're not going to be pulling any books in for a year or two. And they passed that with the head and it was like, right, try it out, see how it goes. And I think that's brilliant. Just even to be able to even to have that conversation, I think it's something that we're not having here. But and then they said, look, we'll review that. And if we notice that standardized scores are slipping or if we're not happy with whatever the outcomes are by the end of the year, I think it's physics, so it's completely outside of my but they noticed at the end of the year, absolutely no impact. And they're able to, everything should be outcome based. But school leaders are in a tricky position. I think most of them probably do agree it's excessive. There are a lot of people reporting at the minute that young teachers, particularly, are leaving the profession. I've heard certainly at three or four teachers I know who've left, and they're all younger than me. None of them are retirement age. Generally, the feeling is it's just too much. It's too much. They're feeling that they're having to take this stuff home at night to do. So I think head teachers probably feel like they need a little bit more support coming from above them to say, listen, you're totally free to free your staff up to focus on the teaching and learning. Whereas I think at the minute, I'm not completely answering you here straight, but I think there's so many things to it. I think they probably feel that they are dropping the ball a wee bit if they were to do that, or to have that conversation. So this is where a lot of the communication from Transform Ed, I think, has the potential to make a big impact here. I think if they come out ahead of this and they're able to say, on a school level, I don't know how they want to word that, but just make it very clear that head teachers should feel empowered to make decisions for the best outcomes for the pupils in their school, and leave that that's a judgment call, and let them do things like what we talked about there. Like, try this out, the idea of being able to peer marking as a class is a fantastic thing. We talk about feedback, but being able to go through something as soon as it's finished, if we're simplifying fractions or something, you as a teacher, you're going through that with them, and that's the most impactful way in real time to assess how well have they got this concept. Do I need to revisit this? Can I move on? Do I need to go back a little bit? How many of the children in this class have experienced success in this? And so on. Whereas, the thought of you just collecting those books in, and if you're doing your job properly, you're not able to look at those books until you go home, because when would you have? So taking those home to then sit at night to figure out which kids got that or didn't get. The whole thing. I think it was Dylan Williams said that marking in schools is something like the biggest PR exercise in history. That's the most unevidenced. It's just this sort of big, again, it's another big, massive, all-consuming drain on resources. And, we are the most expensive resources we've talked about. So yes, to get back to your question, I think head teachers, senior leaders need to be empowered to be able to have, knowing that someone's got their back whenever they tell an inspector or when they explain, no, we're not asking for short-term or medium-term planners because they've got a curriculum in place. They've got a scheme of work. They know, the teacher knows what they're covering in a year. They know what's expected of them. And we're pretty clear through our own internal measures, through our standardized test scores, through our whatever pupil voice, books groups, focus groups. We have a good measure and a good handle on how well the kids are grasping this learning. And we're trying to follow the evidence as best as we are able to, given the confines. And I would have a huge amount of respect for that. Now, there are some principals who are able to make those calls. I've heard of one principal who just said, look, leave inspectors to me. I want you at the front of your class teaching, and go for it. Let rip in this. We really want standards. We want a high level of learning. This is what I get paid for. I'll take any of that. Go and do it. But that's not a normal reaction to this. And I think school leaders need to really feel like their back, someone's got their back in this, and that they can make those calls. And I think I don't think people believe what we could all achieve in a couple of years of this by just having teachers freed up. And in terms of bringing in the changes for Transform Ed, think of the potential for the dynamism and the enthusiasm for all these initiatives. Think of how well you could get staff buying into all this, instead of it just seeming like another thing on top of whatever else I'm being asked to do. I have a friend who's head of teaching and learning in a school, and he's sending out articles every week and newsletters by some of the guys that are really interesting. And he's saying that loads of people aren't even reading it. But they're too busy. They're too busy doing other things, and they don't have the bandwidth. And they just see that how are they going to get behind this? How are they going to invest in this? Because they're already being asked to do this. Whereas if we get this right, we can take all of that away. It's what you're talking about, the work-life balance, Kieran. And you get both. You get to have both. You get to experience success as a teacher, and the pupils feel great about the learning. You're feeling good about it. Back to what you said, but also you're freed up from all that baggage So I've answered that as best I can. I think some head teachers could possibly steam on ahead, but I think there needs to be a bit more backing from all stakeholders in this for this to really properly work well.
Probably a really good place to wrap up this part of the conversation. Will you join me again next week, where we can explore what that PD might look like for both teachers and leaders, maybe how they engage with research? That sounds like something you'd be keen to do, because I think we're only scratching the surface, but I'm conscious it's Monday night on the hot day in June.
Absolutely, Kieran. That sounds good. Yeah, I'm enjoying this.
Fantastic. Well, all I have to do is say thank you very much for joining me. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Thank you, Ken. Good to chat again.
And everyone at home, until next time, thanks for listening.